everyone. All right, I'm gonna have you do an exercise to practice one of the techniques to get reluctant students involved and engaged. So my presentation is not text heavy, but more discussion and interactive. So get prepared to commune with your neighbors. So one of the first things I have to say, engagement is not edutainment. We are not here to entertain students. We are here to educate, but also to create environments in which even your reluctant students want to participate in. And it gets to a sense of why they might be reluctant. And in my time teaching, let me see, this is my 6th year at UA. Before I taught at a HBCU in Northeast North Carolina, where I had first-generation students. And one of the things I had, some of the reluctancy of my students was fear. Fear of failure. And fear of failure in front of their peers. Not that they weren't interested, not that they weren't there, they just were afraid to speak and participate because they were afraid to say the wrong thing. And that if they spoke up and they were wrong, they were afraid of ridicule. So that fear and reluctancy, I want you to think about why they might be reluctant. And oftentimes getting used to my pose, so I'm going to step away from the mic. And when you're teaching an introduction to world civ for first-generation students, when it's 75 to 100 in a room and you see that look, don't take it personal. So I always recommend don't dwell on that student or students. Look to the corners, look around, move your body. This is so awkward being behind. Walk the room. I use my room all the time. And I encourage along the way. So that fear of failure is one of the number one reasons why you might have some reluctancy. The other is the disinterested student. Oftentimes you hear, well, I'm just taking this course to fulfill gen ed, or I just need this here, this is not my subject. And so for them, they might be disinterested because they don't know why that course matters. And I'll echo that was one of the previous presenter talked about show your passion for that topic, explain why they're doing, create them in and bring them involved in the communication. The other thing that you will see with disinterested students and reluctant students, learning styles. Some people might not like the traditional Socratic method. Sometimes you'll hear students say, I'm a visual learner. I need practice. I need different types of engagement. So it might be your teaching style. So always look at and learn from your students and what styles work for them and vary them. And that might bring in more students into the conversation. The other, simply not being prepared for class. That means haven't read, hadn't looked at the assignment, don't even know what the syllabus said for the day. So they might be reluctant to speak because they're just not prepared. So they're trying to hide. And then there's also the last category. You will find this as well. You will simply have students who are petrified of speaking in large groups, who rather hide in the corner, but they're doing the work. You can see them, they're head nodding, but when you get them to try to speak, unless it's in a small group, they won't. And that includes if you have end of the semester presentations for students. I have juniors and seniors who will wait to the very end and they're visibly shaken because they have to stand up here and speak. So that also gives them to reluctance. They might be absent that day of the presentation. They might say, I'm sorry, I'm sick. They actually might become sick in the class because of that. So why they're reluctant, there's a variety of ways, so you can't assume that it's one model. So what I would recommend you doing is recognize this is the variety that you might see. So how do you recognize and balance and bring into the conversation those shy students, those students who are afraid of failure, those who are disinterested, those whose learning style, they're trying to cope and learn in a way that makes sense for them, those who are not prepared, and also to educate, but educate in an inclusive learning, student-centered environment. First and foremost, be you. Bring your personality in. Come in energized, ready to go, and prepared to talk about subjects, including if it's outside your knowledge base. Because one of the things I have, show of hands, how many of you have taught before? Okay, so how many of you taught before in a subject matter that you were comfortable in teaching it? How many of you had to teach a subject that is the first time you ever had to teach that subject? Whether I had to teach World Civ, which is the beginning of man to the present. And it means it's World Civ that they bring in some Europe, it's India and China and Africa. And the first time I did it was when I was in front of the classroom for 165 students in 3 sections. But one thing you have, one, you already have a degree, so you're up, and you read. Number 2, you have read. So you plan ahead, plan exercise. How would you tackle that? But set that environment. The other, learn their names, including the ones who are the shyer students, the ones who seem reluctant. And this is tough. And I can see, like, how can you remember 80 names? Well, I can tell you, I've been teaching a while. My first semester, I had 210 students. No TA. I learned all their names within 2 weeks. When you know their names, they can't hide anymore. And you can call on them, like, I haven't heard from you. What do you, bring that in. And when they realize I can't hide, that changes some things. But also, too, when they're having problems and you're noticing patterns, by knowing their names, you can reach out with some emails and some communications, too. But learn their names. And you are fortunate because Banner includes pictures. Sometimes those pictures change over time, but the first couple weeks I have those pictures there. And I know their names within a week. So when I have a class, if I teach Intro to African American Studies, I'll have 80 students in that. Within a week and a half, I'll know all 80. And I walk the classroom, so I'm always talking from the back of the room, the middle of the room, the front of the room. So those on their computers, I can see what they're doing. But when you learn their names, they realize, oh, I'm invested in you. Oh, I can't hide anymore. She might call on me. I might have to actually get involved in this class discussion. The other is use your classroom space. So for me, this is super awkward. I'd rather be here, off the ground, walking back and forth, looking and teaching the back. If you're in North Carolina, that stadium style, you can stand in the back and there's a microphone there so they can hear you. You move to the middle. You move in between the rows. You go back to the floor to change the song. But when you stay here, you allow a comfort zone for those who don't want to be engaged. So whatever your space is, don't stand here. Move around. And one of the things by moving around and doing that and knowing their names, you can then go up. I haven't heard from you. Can you help out with this next participation here? Your group's going to go first. Or I want to hear your thoughts on that. Oh, put your computer away. but that helps get people involved so they're not disconnected. And the other, read any teaching blogs, any pedagogical techniques, and vary them. So don't always do the same small group project. You might do a 2-minute writing prompt. The 2-minute prompt and then share. Sometimes I open up a class with this, especially when it becomes apparent that they hadn't read. So I'm like, okay, take the first 2 minutes to talk about this broad theme and write it out on a piece of paper. After those 2 minutes, then I have volunteers to read, and for some to have read. And if you're shy or reluctant, you're afraid to think on your feet, you have something to hold on to and read. Sometimes I put this in the middle of a class. I break up my lecture into chunks. So this might be a good halfway point if they understand the concept. Okay, this is the prompt. Can you write for 2 minutes on this? And then share. The other is pair and share, which is common when you go with your neighbor, especially if you're in those large lecture halls. It's kind of hard to maneuver. But there's another one. I call it the observer, the answerer, and the questionnaire. And this is what I'm going to have you work on. This is where you do for 3 people. One person just observes and records what's going on, and then reports back at the end. One person asks the other person questions about whether or not they understand that concept, and one's just answering. At the end of that period, the observer was like, I can see you were struggling on this point where you were asking some great questions over here, and then you flip the roles. So I'm going to have you get in groups of 3, please. Select an observer, select someone to answer the questions, and someone to ask questions. Does everyone have a group of 3? Who needs a group member? Raise hand. Okay. I'm not going to ask you about the previous slide. What I'm going to do is your previous presenter who gave some really good tips about plagiarism, getting students involved, and this concluded. So I want the questioner to ask questions about that last presentation. The one who's answering has to respond, and the observer who's to figure out where your weak points are or the strengths are. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes. All right. Now, in that quick exercise, everyone participated. Even those I observed coming in who were zooming out because it's a long day and I understand what you're saying. Everyone was involved. Everyone, even the observer, because they had to do something active. They had to listen. The questioner had probably I don't have any more questions to ask. I'm trying that process, and those were answering. This is something that crosses different disciplines. It's not just humanities. If you have math problems, if you're in chemistry, if you're in the sciences, there are some concepts you might want them to get involved in to think about. And this is also another way to reinforce that learning and establishing that learning community. Because I stepped back and I yielded the floor to you. And it's that feedback and willing to go back and forth. That's how you get people invested. Now, if you're going through this process and you saw me walk around up here, just looking at various groups, this is where you use that classroom space to make sure that people are not hiding, who are not involved. You might ask, you need clarifying questions and different things. And that comfort zone is key. The last is a series of games that are called Reacting to the Past that uses game theory and game immersion. And one of the reasons why I put this up here was I taught at an HBCU in Northeast North Carolina for 4 years. 90% of the students were on Pell. Many of them were the children of veterans because Elizabeth City State was in the city that had the Coast Guard. JCOM, Joint Communications, was in Hampton Road. So, and we always had a hurricane every year that we were out of school for a week. And sometimes students lost homes to tornadoes. But I had students in one of the poorest parts of the state, and I was asking them to teach World Civ and learn about places in the world where they hadn't even left that part of the world. And when I first taught World Civ, I had a 68 failure rate. And I'm like, I can't have this reality. So I learned and went out and found other learning communities. And one of those was a community out of Columbia University, in particular Barnard University, called Reacting to the Past. These are role immersion games set in history, but based on winning a game. And so some of the games that I did, and this is why they have one-day games that are perfect for one session. So one of the games I used to do all the time was a public health game set in London, 1854, with cholera. And my students loved it, especially my STEM students loved it, because they had to figure out what to do with the amount of people dying, and they were given their character as they came in the room. So they had 5 minutes, got in, and they were forced to engage. And all my students would say, I've read that in the book. I didn't think it was that important. But when I had to make decisions based on that, it became real. I have done games on Frederick Douglass on this campus and others, but I had to look for other ways to get my students involved because they had not a reluctance, but a lack of education and a bar that they need to go up. And that fear of failure was so real that they were afraid to ask questions. So for me, I had to find ways to trick them into learning. And Reacting to the Past is done not just in the nation, but internationally. And as graduate students, you have free access to all unpublished games through Barnard. And they have STEM-specific focus games as well as humanities ones, and some that you can do in just one day. So think about even bringing in game theory and immersion, plus writing workshops, plus other things to get them involved. But the exercise I had you do in the parent share and small groups, you will even get those reluctant students involved and those shyer students. And when you learn their names, move around the classroom. Over time, and I always say it takes a while, it's not right away, but by week 4, it's a different classroom environment. So it will come over time, but one of the things I will say here, you are selected because you can. So one of the biggest obstacles, oftentimes, even with those reluctant students, is fear of yourself and failing to educate. So know you, be you, show your passion, learn when needed, talk to one another, talk to faculty who've been in the ground doing this for a while. Like your student, they had to learn it too. We all had to learn it. So plan ahead, set that learning environment, learn their names, use your classroom space effectively, and learn various engagement techniques and vary them so students are not bored by them. But that's all I have.